Hello, and welcome to The Excerpt. I'm Dana Taylor. Pro-Palestinian demonstrations that began at Columbia University have ignited a wave of similar protests at colleges and universities across the country. Weeks into it, those protests only seem to be intensifying. Thousands have now been arrested. The students' demands vary by campus, but the majority are asking for an end to the Israel-Hamas war and divestment from companies that are financially benefiting from the conflict. In decades past, student activism regarding the Vietnam War, civil rights, and South Africa's apartheid successfully sparked broad social and political change. Has the student-led movement reached the tipping point? To put the current protests in context, I'm now joined by Robert Cohen, professor of social studies education at New York University and a scholar in student activism. Thanks for joining me, Robert.
Okay, nice to be here.
So let's dig right in. This is both a volatile and a rapidly evolving situation. But let's take a step back for a minute and put these demonstrations into context. Are you seeing and hearing the kinds of things that might lead to lasting change? Have we reached the tipping point yet?
Well, I think it has raised more awareness about the war, the U.S. support for the Israeli military in the war. So I think that's probably significant. I think it's more likely to have that kind of impact than the demands that they have for university divestment, mostly because unlike, say, the divestment demands in the 80s over U.S. investments with connection to the apartheid regime in South Africa, there was nobody in the 80s in the United States, practically no one, who supported apartheid because it was racist. Whereas in the United States, there's considerable support for Israel. And so, in fact, there are 30 plus states that have laws against state agencies doing business with companies that have been part of the BDS divestment movement. So only a handful of universities across the country, maybe even less than a handful, have actually divested. So I think that's going to be a much tougher, there's a tougher demand that was made back in the 80s on apartheid. But still, I would say it's a little bit like the Occupy Wall Street demonstrations, which weren't a student movement so much, so they had a student wing. But they were asking, they were so anarchistic, they didn't have a demand. So you can say, well, that they were a failure, but really they helped to change the conversation about economic inequality.
What kinds of signs do you look for in a student-led movement that signal the onset of real change?
Well, I think it's a question of, is the issue that they're promoting, is it getting more discussion? I mean, the more concrete way, like if a more effective movement in terms of its more local demands, are they winning? Are they changing the universities? Like the free speech movement of 1964 asked that the restrictions on student free speech rights be eliminated. And that took a semester of some of the largest protests and the largest mass arrest in American history in UC Berkeley to win that demand. But that's kind of unusual. Student movements usually don't win their it's very rare that they win their demands. And so I think the question is, what's the broader impact? And in a certain sense, like say during the Vietnam era, the student anti-war movement raised awareness of the problems with the war. And so you could say that it helped to turn the country against the war. But even more unpopular than what the war became after the Tet Offensive in 1968 was the student movement was always more unpopular than the war that it was opposing. Because American society is basically conservative culturally and doesn't think that students should be engaged in protest activity for reasons I can discuss with you. But so I would say they're always a mixed bag in terms of their impact, their success. In a way, they kind of boost the left, but in a way, the resentment against them boosts the right.
Well, as you know, several universities have successfully negotiated deals with protest leaders, Brown and Northwestern among them. Is there something about the culture on these campuses that encouraged successful dialogues?
Well, I would just say that's very unusual. In fact, why is it that students are often out in the streets or on the campuses, either doing encampments or just mass demonstrations? Because basically on most college campuses, students are pretty much disenfranchised. Like if you don't like the President of the United States or your senator or congressperson, you can vote them out of office. But if you don't like the investment policies of the university, you don't have any, you're a student, you have no role. You're not consulted. And in fact, a lot of universities have said, like mine at NYU and Columbia, said, no, we won't divest, right? Where a more inclusive, if the governance of the university was more open to students and more, sort of had some democratic element in it, they would say, okay, present your evidence to the Board of Trustees. And there might even be a student on the Board of Trustees, which there are not on private universities, but at least we'll listen to you. And most universities aren't willing to do that. So Brown and Northwestern, they're the exceptions. And I think they show that if you have a process like that, you don't need to have demonstrations, right? So they help to end the demonstrations by actually involving students in decision making, even though they didn't promise to divest.
One of the most heated debates at these protests is free speech versus hate speech. I know you've written extensively on the free speech movement in the 60s. At Columbia, USA Today has interviewed quite a few Jewish students who are taking part in the pro-Palestinian protest, whereas on some campuses, such as UCLA, there have been counter-protests of students who are pro-Israel, and some were quite violent. Why is free speech so fiercely defended on college campuses? Can you please put that into context for us?
Well, a university is really about the free exchange of ideas. And in terms of politics and society, it's supposed to raise uncomfortable questions. And so if we're going to go on the basis of what's popular and only allow popular speech, the university is not going to be able to fulfill its social function. So that's the key reason why you want free speech on campus, is so you can pursue truth. That means two opposite views of the war. If you only have one side, you may not be able to arrive at that, right? It's just what everybody assumes is right. Like the Vietnam War, the dominant view was this was a just crusade against communism. But the anti-war movement on campus said no, it raised questions. And I think 20 years later, a lot of people are willing to say, hey, the movement was right about that. They wouldn't have been able to have that view, to have aired that view, if free speech had been denied.
Universities' tactics in dealing with the encampments and the protesting students vary fairly widely from campus to campus. Some campuses have seen arrests, some suspensions. Some police forces have deployed riot control agents like tear gas. Many of these approaches seem to only escalate tensions. Where's the line historically been that separates peaceful protest from ones that are endangering the safety of other students and the community?
Well, mostly the line is it's called time, place, and manner. That is, you have the right to free speech, but you can't disrupt the basic educational function of the university. So once you've done that, like taking over a building or blockading a classroom, that's really problematic. Like what happened at Columbia there, that when they took over Hamilton Hall, that's a violation of time, place, and manner. But the earlier protest on the lawn, were just people sitting on the lawn, is not disruptive. And the fact that those were suppressed is a kind of, I think, an overreaction and is very uncommon. That was not done in the 60s. In fact, in 1970 or late 60s, if you had done something like that, that would be seen as being very moderate, and the college president would be relieved that you're not trying to take over the administration building or firebomb the RTC building or something like that. So what I'm saying is that the university has become, I think, less tolerant of dissent and is kind of pushing that line about what constitutes disruption. They're pushing that to the right.
Professors and school administrators at Columbia and several other campuses have come out in support of the protesters, in some cases, physically creating a barrier between police and the encampments. This isn't the first time that's happened, though. Historically, how has this played out?
Like at Columbia in '68, when they were protesting against the war and against the poor relations between Columbia and the local Black community, when the police were coming, faculty did put themselves out in front, like line up to try to prevent the police from suppressing the protest. But it doesn't work. I mean, because the police are going to come and arrest whoever's in their way. In fact, there's a famous case at the University of Wisconsin when they were protesting against Dow Chemical, which was recruiting on campus, and they manufactured napalm, which was a chemical weapon used in Vietnam, and which killed a lot of civilians. And there was basically the police riot. The police were beating up the protesters, and some of the students came in to the professor's office a sociologist, and they asked him to come out. And he came in and thought, well, he was so naive at that point, because this is really early in the anti-war movement, he thought that he could tell the police to go home, the police to stop beating up the students, and the students to go home. And there's a famous photo when he did that. He's talking to one police officer, and telling them to stop it and telling the students to go home. Another police officer didn't hear it and tries to hit him on the head, and the students kind of jump over him. And it's a famous photo of showing, in a sense, how naive he was, but how ineffective the faculty are when they try to protect the students. It's noble that they try to, but they don't have any more power actually than the students do, really, unless it change university policy in a vote of the academic senate.
The question of who's funding these protests has been a contentious one. What do you know here, and what's been the history of protest funding in the past?
That's to me, that's like a red herring. The students are out there because they're upset about the war, all the civilian casualties that come to them instantly on social media. They're not coming because someone's funding it. I mean, people can contribute, whatever, but you don't need much money to go out and sit out on the lawn or sit in. All during the 60s, those kind of charges were made, like Moscow Gold, the students are getting aid from communists. But the CIA investigated that under President Johnson, and they said, no, they're not like communist directed. The students are not dupes of the Communist Party. And Johnson was unhappy with that result, so he never publicized the study that came out much later. But I think that's like an outside agitator argument. It's not nonsense, because there can be some people outside who join in demonstrations or people who contribute money, but it's not being funded. And the idea, I've read things about people on the right saying that Soros is funding this. That's just like anti-Semitic nonsense. There's not any example of mass protest in the country that's being created by outside funds.
Some college administrators are saying that non-student agitators are adding fuel to the fire, co-opting the movement for their own goals. Is this a valid concern, or do outsiders, have they historically played a minor role?
Well, I think it's like trying to blame people who are not on campus for something you don't like on campus. There are, like, if you have a demonstration that's organized from the campus and it marches like here to Washington Square Park, it's off campus, people off campus have a First Amendment right to join a demonstration. And unless you're saying I have to check IDs, that was done at the encampment here, but not during mass demonstrations. So there will be people, because the public concern about the war in Gaza is not restricted to the campuses. So I think we shouldn't get like hyper or paranoid about outsiders coming in. Although it is true, I saw in Colombia that there was one long-time outside, radical who was involved. But again, that's not, the students do what they want to do. In fact, actually in the 60s, there's a good expression Jack Weinberg and the free speech movement had when they were trying to blame the student protest movement on elder communists. He said, we have a saying in the movement, don't trust anyone over 30. And really, that wasn't even a saying. And it was then used to talk about the generation gap in America more broadly. But he was just trying to say, we run our own movement. And that's generally true of student movements in the United States. There's not really any student movement I can think of, and I've been studying it for decades, you could say was produced by some outside agitators.
Is there anything else that we didn't touch on that you'd like to add before we go?
Well, I think the unpopularity of the student movements, not just this one, but all of them. That is, if you think about it, the sit-in movement in 1960, the Freedom Riders in 61, the free speech movement in 64, the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War, all were unpopular, underwater in terms of their polling. And why was that? I think because of the basic cultural conservatism of our society, thinking that students really should obey their elders, study, and be seen and not heard. It's like it doesn't matter what the students are asking for, it's always going to be unpopular. And they're all often going to be caricatured in the press. Like today, people saying, like you were implying, oh, this is something that something funded by Hamas or something, or some outside agitators are making it happen. That's a way of kind of like, acting as if the students can't think for themselves. Or the idea that there was a cartoon in the Washington Post the other day that made it, before any violence happened on campus, how do we suppress these violent movements when they're not violent? And they're basically, most of them have been nonviolent. There have been a few exceptions. So I'm just saying that there is a tendency to really be dismissive of student protests because their students are kind of getting out of their lane. And I just want to say that it would be nice, I think, if people were, try to resist that kind of strong social pull to do that and try to just look at the students, objectively. Like this movement, for all its flaws, and it has them, is really about stopping killing, stopping war. And what would we rather have, like the peace of the graveyard where nobody dissents? I think that's really problematic. I think I'd rather have a college generation, even when it makes mistakes, be trying to mobilize against war and killing.
Thank you for being on The Excerpt, Robert.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for watching. I'm Dana Taylor. I'll see you next time.